Good morning, everybody. Just want to welcome you to the Vaccinations Chamber webinar with Fisher Phillips and Mr. Chris Alvarez. Just wanted to let you know that we will start this webinar in a few minutes, so please be patient and we'll be back in a few minutes. So it'll start promptly at about 11 o'clock. Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I would like to thank all of you for taking time today from your busy schedules to be with us today. We really appreciate that. My name is Glenn Fuji, and I'm Project Director for the Mbda CARES Act, and we're associated with the Cal-Asian Chamber. And the Chamber has partnered with the Minority Business Development Agency, Mbda CARES Act Center, and they have been part of this agreement for going on 2 years now. We're also partnering today with SBDC, Small Business Development Center, Northern California region, and the MBDA Business Center to present this webinar today. The MBDA is the only federal agency dedicated to the growth and global competitiveness of minority business enterprises. As part of the provisions under the CARES Act, MBDA has dedicated several centers to support businesses impacted by COVID-19. And today, Fisher Phillips, Mr. Chris Alvarez, discusses all aspects of vaccines in the workplace, including mandates, exemptions, employer obligations, and best practices. And at this time, I would like to introduce Elizabeth Merced Coleman, Project Coordinator for the SBDC NorCal region. Elizabeth?
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you again for joining us today. As Glenn mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Merced Coleman, the Project Coordinator for the NorCal Small Business Development Center's affiliate program. As an affiliate of SBDC, the Cal-Asian Chamber focuses on providing the technical assistance services and one-on-one consultations to small businesses in the Northern California region to navigate through the pandemic. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we've assisted businesses in acquiring a variety of funding options, pivoting strategies, marketing services, and getting set up online. SBDC is your partner for success, and it comes at no cost to you. One last thing, we'd greatly appreciate your feedback on today's webinar presentation. This will help us become more aware of the pressing needs and to better assist our small business owners. Thank you, and I'll go ahead and pass this over to Morgan McIntyre, the project coordinator for the Mbda Cares.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Elizabeth. Like Elizabeth mentioned, my name is Morgan, and I am the project coordinator for the CARES program at the Cal Asian Chamber of Commerce. So before we get started, going over just a few logistics, we will have a Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. So please put all of your questions in the chat box, and we will try to get to all of them. If we don't, we will find all of your answers and contact you via email to get all of your questions answered. You're also able to reach out to me personally. I'll be leaving my email in the chat, and I will be your point of contact for any further questions. Every participant will be getting a recording of this webinar as well as the presentation. So no need to worry about notes there. And like Elizabeth had mentioned, there will be a survey at the end of this webinar. That will be via email, as well as you will be prompted after this, and we would just really appreciate your feedback on that. So with all of that being said, we will pass this on over to our speaker, Chris Alvarez. Chris is an associate at the Sacramento office of Fisher Phillips, and he works to counsel and advise clients on labor's and employment law matters. So Chris, you can take it away.
Thanks, Morgan. Hope everyone is having a great morning / afternoon now. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, so everyone can just bear with me, and I'll get that set up here. All right, just to make sure, is my slide here shown on everyone's screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so as Glenn mentioned, today we're going to be talking about vaccine policies, best practices, and trends for small businesses. A bit of our presentation, I'll start with an overview here. Some of the topics we'll highlight and discuss are: 1, can employers mandate vaccines? What are the legal considerations and limitations with respect to vaccinations and requirements at the workplace? Can employers incentivize vaccines? Not necessarily mandate them, but encourage, and how so? The current state of vaccinations and mandates with respect to vaccines in California and San Francisco, and we'll focus more on California. I think I deleted some slides here with respect to San Francisco, because San Francisco has its own mandates that are unique to the city and county of San Francisco. And last, recent COVID-related litigation. So with respect to your options as an employer relating to vaccinations at the workplace, what are your options? Essentially, you have 3. You can start off by merely encouraging the employees to do so. And a little bit of background about that option. That first option is based on the pandemic preparedness guidance documents that were issued by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission back in 2009, when, if you guys remember, the H1N1 virus outbreak occurred. And really the approach that the EEOC took is that generally under the Federal Americans with Disability Act, covered employees should employers should simply encourage their employees to get vaccinated rather than requiring them. So that's sort of the impetus of option 1. Option 2 here is a hybrid option, which really touches on a mandate with respect to vaccinations for certain employees. For instance, mandating employees who cannot work remotely and cannot fully socially distance in the workplace. And then the third option that we employers have are full-blown mandate with respect to vaccinations at the workplace. With respect to option 3 here, keep in mind, it's very important that not just 3, but these options should be considered on a case-by-case basis. And to make sure that you as the employer develop a uniform approach and practice with respect to whatever option is chosen. Also, California, as many of you probably already know, has passed some orders mandating vaccination for certain employees. For instance, the California Department of Public Health issued an order in August earlier this month mandating vaccinations for all healthcare workers, certain healthcare workers by September 30th, unless certain exemptions are met. So if there's a mandate, and you're an employer, obviously you don't necessarily have these 3 options available to you. So just generally, I want to touch base on vaccinations, not necessarily with respect to COVID-19, but sort of the background of this, because it'll give us a better sense of how to approach it at the workplace. So under the ADA, in general, if a vaccination requirement screens out or tends to screen out individuals with a disability, the employer has to show that the unvaccinated employees would pose a direct threat due to a significant, and this is in quotes, due to a significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of individuals or others that cannot be eliminated or reduced by a reasonable accommodation. It's a mouthful, but essentially a question that sometimes comes up with respect to this guidance is when may an employee be excluded from the workplace for not being vaccinated? So there's 2 requirements for that. 1, if they're a direct threat, and then 2, if the vaccinations are a part of a safety qualification standard, which I believe are in later slides. We'll get into them in later slides, but essentially with respect to the prong of if they are a direct threat, the question we want to ask ourselves is, would an unvaccinated worker pose significant risk of substantial harm based on reasonable medical judgment, which cannot be eliminated by a workplace accommodation? And I'll tell you right now, this standard is pretty high to meet and is difficult to show. With respect to the other standard of a vaccination as part of the safety qualification standard, that's viewed from an objective standpoint. It's historically tied to job protecting public safety concerns. The standard must be that it must be job related and consistent with the business necessity in order to determine whether it meets that qualification standard. When trying to determine whether you can exclude employees from the workplace for not being vaccinated. So under California, can California employers require vaccinations? And let me just preface this. You'll see a lot that I toggle between federal law and California law. And it should be pretty apparent, we being part of the US, we still are subject to federal law. But as many of you employers know, California is sometimes and often more protective of the employee. And that means employers under California law tend to have more requirements under state law than under federal law. So I'll toggle back and forth between the Fair Employment and Housing Act in California, and then what the EEOC and their guidelines. So in California, can California employers require vaccination? Short answer is yes, but there are concerns and issues that need to be addressed. 2 very apparent ones is a requirement poses a potential risk of disability discrimination under both federal, the ADA law, and California, the Fair Employment and Housing Act, or the FEHA. It also gives rise to potential exposure for religious discrimination, right? And what we're seeing with respect to these mandates and requirements for vaccinations is the state is really carving out exemptions under mainly two scenarios. One is for medical reasons. And this is where the disability discrimination comes in, potentially. And the other is for religious reasons. And that's why, again, you'll see here, religious discrimination could be a potential issue when requiring vaccinations here in California. All right. So what if you require vaccines? One of the main highlights here is managers and supervisors are responsible for communicating with employees about the compliance with the employer's vaccination requirements. And they should know how to recognize an accommodation request from an employee with a disability or an employee seeking a religious exemption, right? The two issues that we just talked about. And your managers and supervisors, when communicating with the employees about compliance with respect to vaccination requirements, should know who to reach out to when a request is made with respect to some form of exemption or a medical issue, for instance, is raised, and who they should refer those issues to. Oftentimes it's HR, if you're big enough to have an HR department or unit. And I recommend that be the case so that the communications moving forward from there is uniform with respect to what HR is saying, implementing, and how they handle these issues versus, on the fly among managers and supervisors who may not have a uniform talking points when it comes to how to handle this or practice with respect to how to handle this. So one of the things I recommend is speaking to your managers and supervisors and training them with respect to what these issues look like, and then who they should refer these issues to. HR, in my example, or my recommendation. For this slide, the important takeaway here is to engage and document communications with employees to determine whether a reasonable accommodation is needed and whether it's feasible. All right. So disability discrimination. So I'm providing this here as background. Here it's the information here pertains to the ADA, federal law, which should be considered in determining whether to require vaccinations, just like what I was saying earlier. Again, keep in mind that California's Fair Employment and Housing Act provides similar and oftentimes additional requirements that employers need to take into consideration. The point here is that with respect to this slide, is that a person's medical condition or disability could exempt the employee from receiving a vaccination. All right. So with respect to disability accommodations, again, the takeaway here is your obligation as the employer to engage in a good faith interactive process to identify any reasonable accommodations that could be provided, right? So if we're taking one step forward and we're talking about whether to mandate vaccines and you do implement some policy with respect to that, we want to make sure that we're accommodating those who have medical reasons for not participating in mandatory vaccinations or taking the vaccine. As a side note, oftentimes employers want to ask more information from the employee to see if, whether the medical reason for not taking or not getting vaccinated is actually valid, or they just want to know. I would avoid that. If a doctor's note, for instance, says otherwise, that they cannot take the vaccine, the safest and less riskier approach is that the employer should just work to accommodate that limitation provided by the doctor. And I know there's this underlying message or underlying thought in a lot of people's mind, and it says it here too, that most individuals with disabilities will not be prevented from taking or getting the vaccine or getting vaccinated. But still, irrespective of that, we still need to take into account any medical conditions, especially if they're raised by through an employee's doctor, through a medical note, for instance. All right, a little more on disability discrimination here. When may an employee be excluded from the workplace for not being vaccinated? And this is something I just talked about not too long ago. Again, the two factors is it would be a direct threat, and if it's part of a safety qualification standard. As I mentioned before, this direct threat prong is a high standard to meet and a very difficult one to establish. And with respect to the latter here, the vaccination as a safety qualification standard, the standard must be job related and consistent with the business necessities of the job. All right. Again, the safety qualification standard, like I said, it's not as difficult to meet in comparison to the direct threat standard. The point here is the safety qualification standard needs to be objective, must be job related, and consistent with business necessities. All right. So the next topic is proof of vaccination. Can you request proof of vaccination? And we'll get into more of this as well down down the slides later with respect to documentations. But under the EEOC, you may obtain proof of vaccination in a limited capacity. The inquiry should stop once you request proof of vaccination. We shouldn't go into more detail with, what medical disabilities the person has, for instance, related to the inquiry. Medical information should be kept confidential, and the employees should be instructed not to provide genetic information up front. That stuff includes, families, members, medical history like diabetes, for instance, high blood pressure, etc. Another question and some practice that often comes up is vaccination pre-screening questions. A lot of employers, rather than moving forward with vaccinations, either requiring them or encouraging them, sort of defer to the pre-screening questions to determine whether if an outbreak occurred or should the person quarantine, those kinds of issues. So with respect to pre-screening questions, the CDC does recommend that certain pre-screening questions ahead of time before administering a vaccine. Just keep in mind, with respect to those questions, I highly encourage you to make sure, as the employer, to make sure those questions satisfy the requirements of the ADA, because those questions are subject to ADA standards for disability-related inquiries. There is a caveat, though. Those requirements are unnecessary if two things occur: if the vaccination is voluntary, or if the employee receives vaccination from a third party not contracted by the employer, like a pharmacy, for instance, or other healthcare provider. Let's move on to the next slide here. And that's what they are, what I just mentioned. With respect to vaccinations being voluntary, keep in mind the employer's decision to answer would also need to be voluntary, and that the employee should be entitled to change his or her mind and cannot be retaliated for it. And again, it's important to keep all medical information confidential. All right. So we spent quite some time talking about disability accommodations or medical related accommodations. The other factor that I talked about that often comes up with respect to exempting those from any requirement to take or to receive a vaccination has to do with religion. and those are religious accommodations. So the question is often posed, what if my employer raises a religious objection to the vaccination? The short answer is the less risky approach here is to not question a religious exemption issue. The way the laws are, it's very protective of employees, not so much favorable when it comes to those who employ or the employer. So from my world with respect to counseling employers on legal issues and preventing lawsuits in the future, so it's the prevention and the advice issues or type work that I do. Really, my objective is to reduce the risk of potential exposure, right? Because under California law, and matter of fact, probably most laws throughout the U.S., an employee can pretty much, or a person can pretty much sue his or her employer, regardless the person has strong claims, weak claims, etc. Especially here in California, because the laws tend to be very favorable, again, for the employee. So when it comes to these religious issues that are raised, again, taking the viewpoint of reducing the potential risk of exposure, i.e. liability or a lawsuit being filed, again, the approach recommended to take is to not question these religious exemption requests or religious objections. There may be instances where I would defer from that. For instance, if a person claims his or her religion to be one that is not an actual religion, at that point, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to Morgan and we can touch base. All right, voluntary vaccination policies. And these next slides really address vaccination incentives. And as much as we think us as employers can do a great job and have a great role with incentivizing employees to become vaccinated, I will just say it's not a simple alternative. There are things we still need to consider as the employer. And the main point here with this slide is that the employer still needs to consider the applicable laws when determining whether to implement some form of vaccination incentives for its employees or its workforce. Some of these laws include, like what I just talked about, federal ADA, the Fair Employment and Housing Act, and then you have Title VII, which deals with discrimination or retaliation at the workplace. You have HIPAA, the ACA, you got the Fair Labor and Standards Act, you got related state and local laws, including California Labor Code. An example I can be happy to share is that some employers have considered limiting group health plan coverage to those that are vaccinated or who are vaccinated, or even perhaps limiting health plan claims for COVID-19 related illnesses only to those who have been vaccinated. And the goal here is that these employers are hoping to incentivize those who are not yet vaccinated to become vaccinated. However, in this instance where this incentive plan is being used, these suggestions and practices would violate HIPAA's non-discrimination rules, and should be avoided. So my point is, make sure you as the employer or your HR team is considering applicable laws when determining, one, whether to implement any vaccination incentives, and two, if you do decide to implement it, make sure that you're also considering these issues. Okay. One thing an employer may do is they can condition an incentive such as a vaccination incentive offered in terms in the amount of an employee premium contribution on an employee's participation on a wellness program. And that's what this slide pertains to. I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with this type of program or system as it pertains to smoking cessation programs. Oftentimes we see that wellness program and questionnaires in the workplace about smoking incentivizing employees not to smoke. I will point out, though, that complications may arise if the program is, one, not voluntary in view of the applicable history, guidance, and court decisions. Two, if the incentive offered is too high. And I just read here, the EEOC proposes rules limiting only permitting de minimis incentives. That means not large incentives. The takeaway here is really the higher incentive it is, or you're providing, the more risk you will have with potential exposure. Since we're on the topic of incentivizing employees to potentially get vaccinated, before considering any other options, it's worthwhile to evaluate whether you can actually make progress in your drive to improve vaccination rates by just simply offering information, targeted information, and information opportunities to your workers about the vaccine. Oftentimes this may be enough to get your employees vaccinated, if that's the route you're trying to, your goal here, if that's your goal. As you know, as we all know, many people are flooded with information about COVID-19 vaccines from social media, many of which are disinformation or not reliable. They're getting news from non-reputable news sources, and oftentimes through word of mouth. So, we may, as the employer, help sort of alleviate those issues with respect to disinformation or non-reputable information by, again, offering targeted informational opportunities for your workers. Some options to consider, if this is a route you and your team want to take, is having your HR department, your legal department, or your company leadership to present informal questions and answers, perhaps through a Q&A session or even through a Q&A document. That's something we often do for our clients here at Phillips. Another option to consider is inviting representatives from the medical community or other public health officials to your workplace or your business for a lunch and learn series to talk about these issues, similar to what we're doing now. You could do it internally at your workplace. Some other options that I've seen employers do is show videos that are available from the CDC or other sources about vaccines to help spread or help stop the spread of wrong information. Another option, which could potentially backfire, but another option is to solicit questions ahead of time through some kind of confidential means and answer them in group settings. But again, if you're going to do this, it does raise the risk of some questions that may be difficult to answer. So my advice is to make sure you're working with your HR department, your legal team, and if need to, any community people from who are knowledgeable with respect to the medical community and public health officials. All right, going back to documentation and vaccination with respect to vaccines. The question here comes up, the question that often comes up is, as an employer, what documentation am I required to maintain to help prevent the spread of COVID-19, if any? So Cal OSHA recently issued emergency temporary standards, or ETS, to help prevent the spread of COVID-19. If anybody here actually took a peek at these standards, one thing you'll notice is that they're confusing. And then even more so because they were revised, which raises some questions about our obligation as employers with respect to documentation and what we need to do, what documents we need to hold, and how long, etc. So for instance, this example on the screen here, the previous proposal said that employers must have documentations that the employee was fully vaccinated. That suggests that it needs to be in the employer's possession and maintained by the employer with respect to, for instance, vaccination cards or copies of it. The revised language says that the employer has documented the employee is fully vaccinated. So it sort of suggests now that the employer doesn't need to maintain it. They just need to have at some point documented. Kind of confusing, and it could be just me as an attorney looking too much into this and probably splitting hairs over words, but that's what we do as a living. Thankfully, Cal OSHA provided some recent guidance and talked about what are acceptable options when it comes to our obligations to maintain and document this information. So these three acceptable options identified by Cal OSHA are: one, the employees can provide proof of vaccination and the employer maintains a copy. That would be through, for instance, a vaccine card, an image of the vaccine card, or some other healthcare document showing vaccination status. A second option is that employees provide proof of vaccination that the employer will then maintain, but not the vaccination record itself or the vaccination card itself. And the other option that many employers are taking is what's called a self-attest and maintain approach, where the employee self-attests to vaccinations, his or her vaccination status, and the employer maintains a record of who self-attested, meaning who actually said they were vaccinated. So a few other considerations with respect to vaccinations here. What if an employee at the workplace declines or refuses to disclose his or her vaccination status? Well, the short answer is that in that case, we as the employer must treat that individual as an unvaccinated person and must not take any disciplinary actions or discriminatory actions or retaliatory actions against the person. Essentially, the person has a right to decline to state, if they want to, of whether they're vaccinated or not. So what does this all mean for everyone? What it means is essentially you should review your written plan with respect to COVID-19. If you don't have one, I strongly recommend you create one. And if you need assistance doing so, feel free to reach out to Morgan and we can set you up that way. Review your COVID-19 prevention programs and policies, any notices you may have that you've been issuing to employees, especially new hires. Because some of that information in the notices could have changed. As we know, especially in the beginning, the laws and regulations with respect to COVID-19 and obligations as an employer changed dramatically and very quickly over the last year or so. I recommend also that you review your vaccination considerations discussed above. And evaluate how you're going to handle documenting vaccination status. Most of those issues should be straightforward, hopefully. But what's sort of changing the landscape with respect to legal issues and employment issues is now the Delta variant is well known. And we all know that those who are vaccinated can still get the Delta variant. So I would say keep an eye out with respect to any orders or regulations or laws that may be coming forward soon to address the Delta variant, especially at the workplace. All right. Vaccinations in California, in case anyone's interested. Here are the stats of those who received or who are vaccinated by city and county here in California. You can see here in Sacramento, we're somewhere towards the median, whereas a lot of the lower rates are from rural counties. Another thing to consider when it comes to vaccinations and requirements with respect to COVID-19 is that counties and cities can have their own local ordinances, sometimes that go further than what the state requires, right? For instance, we've seen some cities and counties requiring masks at indoor public places, others not. Also keep in mind that, I kind of touched on this earlier, that there are government mandates with respect to certain employers and employees to be vaccinated. We've seen the vaccination, mandatory vaccination orders for certain healthcare employers or employees. And by September 30th, those employees would need to be fully vaccinated unless they fall under one of the two exemptions we talked about, which really deal with the medical exemption or religious exemption. All right, getting close to the end here, and I don't mean to scare anybody, but one of the things we are seeing in our practice is since the start of the pandemic, we're seeing an increase of COVID-19 employment-related claims being made at the workplace. Here are some stats. May not seem that there are a lot of cases with respect to COVID-19 employment litigation. You can see from March of last year to August of this year, there's been a total of 1,195 cases that have been filed. And you can imagine a lot of these cases come from California. And what you'll see and what we've been seeing is that the most common type of cases as a result of COVID-19 at the workplace tend to be discrimination cases. And the most impacted industry we've at least been seeing has to do with the healthcare industry. And that could be partly because of the mandates that have been implemented recently with respect to vaccinations at the workplace. It could be because the healthcare industry has been really impacted by COVID-19. So with respect to the popular claims, as I mentioned, the most common one we tend to see is discrimination. Oftentimes, these come in the form where an employee wants to work from home because of COVID-19 concerns or COVID-19 safety issues, and works from home as a form of potential reasonable accommodation. And then at some point, the employer says, it's not doable for this employee to work from home. The employee needs to come in, employee refuses, and then gets terminated as a result. What we see is that these claims turn into an allegation that the person was discriminated against and even retaliated against because they raised safety concerns about COVID-19 at the workplace. So just be wary of that. If you have employees who are refusing to come to work and you have the proper PPEs and proper policies and safety precautions for employees to work, and you're considering whether to terminate that employee because really working from home may not be, for instance, productive, I strongly recommend reaching out to Morgan and we can connect to talk about how to address those and what steps to take, again, to reduce the potential exposure of liability. Another popular claim that's coming up is wage and hour issues. We're seeing, for instance, claims for reimbursement where the employee is working from home and is required to use his or her cell phone now personal cell phone for work issues. Time for testing if they're required to be tested at the workplace or the employer is requiring mandatory testing for COVID-19. Questions often come up, well, if they're being tested, is that compensable time? We're seeing issues with respect to that. And same with costs associated with testing. The recommendation is that the employer pay for the testing if we're requiring employees to do so. But you'll be surprised it being cost, sometimes cost prohibitive, because the number of employees, for instance, that are required to be tested, we're seeing some employers skirting that cost to the employee for whatever reason. And we're seeing some issues arising out of that. Another popular claim has to do with leave issues. And oftentimes these come up in the form of, again, discrimination or retaliation. But it's similar to an employee wanting to take leave because they have a medical condition or concerns at the workplace with respect to COVID-19. The person takes a leave that feels like it could be indefinite, or they just keep renewing through a doctor's note. They keep extending the date return to work, when they return to work. And at some point, employers may often feel that, look, this person is just not going to be able to come to work. They're avoiding coming to work. I'm having a hardship here. Do I replace that person? Can I terminate that person? How do I move forward? So again, if those issues come up, I strongly recommend reaching out to Morgan and we can connect, or your local counsel if you have one, or your legal department. All right, and one of the things we're seeing is that most of the cases here with respect to COVID-19 are filed against small and medium-sized employers, those between 100 and 500 employees, 1 to 500 employees. All right, we'll come into a close. Some helpful resources for everyone, which I think everyone should receive a copy of this presentation, are listed here on this slide. And internally, our firm puts together resources for employers that are easily available on our website. Feel free to get as much information as you want. Download that information from our website. It's free. We did it because we know employers and our clients are struggling, and this information will help hopefully alleviate the immediate concerns that may arise due to COVID-19 and the impact it has at your workplace. All right. And lastly, if you have any questions moving forward, feel free to reach out to Morgan and the team. And they know how to get a hold of me, and we can connect and collaborate with any questions you may have and talk about some issues if you want to talk about next steps and recommended approaches. I just want to thank everybody for your time, and that's it on my end.
Okay, Chris. Well, thank you very much. And Morgan, are there any questions in the Q&A or chat?
Yes, we have one question asking Chris if you could talk more about direct threat being a high standard. Does that mean that vaccine requirements are not legal right now? Oh, you're muted, Chris.
Did a rookie move. No, I simply pointed that out because I wanted to provide some full disclosure with respect to, the different types of laws, what issues arise out of that, and then we can then come up with a game plan with respect to how to move forward. So long as we're meeting the standards of mandated, if we're trying to do mandated vaccines at the workplace, so long as we're meeting those standards under federal, state, and even local, it should work. With respect to federal, that's where the EEOC stuff comes in. Oftentimes that can raise an issue that employers just don't want to deal with. But I would say, I do mention it is a high standard, but it will really depend on the type of business at issue and the type of work being performed. So for whoever asked that question, I would recommend reaching out to Morgan. We could chat about, if we need to, the additional issues at the workplace, the type of work being done, and then come up with the game plan. If the plan is either to do mandatory vaccines or create some kind of incentive program.
Okay, we have one more question here. The universities are requiring people to get vaccinated now. Is this legal? And what's the trend in California in regards to employee rights?
Yeah, so I know employers are requiring vaccinations. Some are, and they include, the healthcare industry. I believe the UC system is doing it as well. And I don't know, and some schools actually. So with respect to whether they're legal or not, without knowing more, I can't advise on that. I understand, at least for the UCs, their implementation, they have a strong legal team that went through that process and analyzed the legal ramifications of the mandatory vaccinations. And I again, without knowing more, I would suspect that whatever the mandatory vaccination requirement is, it's on par and compliant with the laws, both state and federally. The trend in California regarding employee rights, we're seeing some pushback from employees in the form of potential claims made against the employer who are thinking about mandatory vaccination. But as of right now, there's really not a big push, at least with employers, for mandatory vaccinations across the board. I think employers are generally relying on the orders or laws coming out either from the state, locally, or federally because of these issues with respect to, with those raised by these employees, whether it's a religious issue, a medical issue, whatever issue they may raise. I've seen questions or concerns coming out of an employee's right, quote unquote, right to not get the vaccine. So oftentimes employers are sort of staying away from the mandatory vaccines, at least what I'm seeing now. But that may change depending on, again, the laws that are be coming out, maybe in the near future.
Okay, and we have a few more minutes, so please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A chat, and we will answer those for you. I also just want to remind all of our participants that we do have a second part to this webinar series with Chris coming up on September 15th at 11 a.m. again. And those that register and attend both of these webinars will be entered to win one-on-one consulting with Chris. So I do want to remind everyone that, and we will also send you out a little reminder afterwards as well.
Thank you, Morgan. And Chris, thank you so much for this great presentation today. So much information. Really appreciate your support and providing this to our small business communities out there. For all you small businesses here today, please take this information seriously. Ensure that all of your employees are notified and made aware, and really try to be consistent and with your policy development. And if you have any questions after this presentation today, this webinar today, feel free to contact Morgan. As Chris mentioned, we will direct the questions to Chris and get answers back to you promptly. So again, thank you so much for everyone today, taking your time to be with us, and we really appreciate your support. And if there's any needs that you need or have for your small businesses, please let Morgan know, and we'll try to develop those type of webinars in the future. So thank you again, and please answer the survey as part of this, and we'll send the recordings and presentation out to you. Chris, any final words?
Thank you everyone for your time. And like Glenn said, reach out to Morgan if you want to connect, and wishing you guys the best and during these untrying and unprecedented times.
Thank you again. And we really appreciate your support. And I forgot to mention, thank you, Jennifer, for your support as well. And look forward to seeing you at the second series. You guys have a great day and take care. Thank
Hi,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.